Alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. How are my brothers doing today? So, today we are going to continue with the refutation of Har Sultan. We have done the introduction, the first chapter, the second chapter, the third and sixth chapter already. You can find it on my channel on the playlist and I've labeled it Refutation of Har Sultan's book. So, you guys can go and see the previous discussions there. Today we are gonna be continuing with Refuting Har Sultan with chapter 4, the God hypothesis. So before I get into refuting Har Sultan, I need to point out that the layout of this book is very much inspired by the God delusion of Richard Dawkins. Har Sultan is somewhat of a fanboy of Richard Dawkins. So, so he does. So the first individual to kind of talk about the God hypothesis in this fashion is Richard Dawkins. So he's very much inspired by it. And this causes a slight issue. The way that Har Sultan argues in his book, okay, is very Christian oriented, even though his main target is Islam, meaning even though he uses those kind of arguments to target toward Islam. And even though, yes, in the introduction of his book, he said that his book is aimed towards all concepts of God, but due to him being more well versed with Islam, he mentions Islam most. But this is just intellectual dishonesty because much of those arguments just do not apply to Islam because of the Islamic view of God or prophethood. Okay, so let's read this. So the God hypothesis, chapter 4. Either God can do nothing to stop catastrophes like this, or he doesn't care, or he doesn't exist. Therefore, God is either impotent, evil, or imaginary. Take your pick and choose wisely. This is what we call the problem of evil. Okay, or to be more precise, we wouldn't necessarily call this specifically the problem of evil. This would be Epicurus paradox, meaning if God is all good, all powerful, and all knowing, okay, all good, all powerful, okay. So if there was evil and he could stop it, then he would stop it. If he can't stop it, then he's not all powerful. And if there is evil and he doesn't want to stop it, then he is not good because he's not stopping evil even though he can. If he can stop it and he knows that this is bad and he doesn't stop it, then he's not all powerful. This is what the paradox tries to aim towards. This is a somewhat bad argument, a very bad argument. Okay, the issue with this kind of reasoning is it doesn't understand God as a whole. In Islam, we have the concept that God is all wise, all just, all knowing, and all powerful. Okay. So it's all together. All of those attributes come together. So if there is something that you deem as evil, okay, or immoral, and God lets it happen, there might be a greater plan, or what we can say is hikmah. You might see the picture, or you might see the pixel while God sees the picture. So this is where the distinction arises. So yeah, this argument is very bad, and it has been refuted multiple times. Now let's go on. What does Har Sultan say? Billions of people believe in different gods. They believe created the universe. One of the most common arguments he used is, well, you don't know this and that, so God did it. This is called the God of the gaps argument. The thing with this is, does Islam say this argument? Okay, just because you don't know did it means God did it. Okay, Islam has a very precise argumentation. Okay, we say every contingent phenomenon, the very nature of it being contingent means that that it is one of the possibilities, and if it is one of the possibilities, then it is dependent on God. Okay, we prove that. We prove that every contingent thing depends on God. So even if you're not able to explain something, okay, we have already proved if it is contingent, then it is dependent on God. Okay, this would be what Imam al-Ghazali rahimahullah kind of argues in his sorry in his book. This is what he argues in his book, uh, Iqtisad al-I'tiqad, where he talks about this. Okay, when he's proving God. So let's move on. One of the greatest minds of modern science, Sir Isaac Newton, believed in God. He was a genius who invented calculus because he wanted to work out the movement of the planet, and he succeeded. But when the calculation became complicated and he couldn't work out the orbits because of the gravity of multiple undiscovered planets, he gave up and simply said God did it. What do you really think that just because he was not able to explain it, he said God did it? Isaac Newton, he was a genius. He truly was a genius. But he believed that the evidence of God was so obvious and so clear that God is responsible for everything. He even said that if there was no evidence of God and you just gave me the thumb as an evidence, that would be enough to prove God. Okay, so it is not that he's saying that, oh, I cannot explain this, hence God did it. Oh, he believes everything, God did everything. Okay, so yeah, and also Isaac Newton was, people will say he was Christian. Once again, Haris, the book's name is The Curse of God, Why I Left Islam. What does arguments that work against Christianity and Sir Isaac Newton have to do with you leaving Islam? It is not a very good argument of you leaving Islam, Haris. Just saying. In today's world, theists say you cannot explain the origin of life, so God did it. Muslims do not say this. No Muslim gives this argument, so I'm not gonna even bother with this. Okay, now let's analyze the mind of atheists. They believe everything was created by God by magic. Of course, we know the universe started with the Big Bang 13.8 billion years ago. Okay, so first of all, the universe started with a Big Bang. About the universe starting with a Big Bang 13.8 billion years ago, and you saying that you know it? No, you don't know it. Okay, you cannot say we know the universe. Okay, there is disagreement among scientists. Okay, and the scientific paradigm changes. It could be in the future that rather than 13.8 billion years ago, scientists will say 14, 15, 16 billion years ago. It could increase due to further evidences. It was believed to be it used to be believed 11 billion years ago, I believe, if I'm precise. The time was less. Scientists used to believe the universe was a few billion years less old. Now they believe it at 13.8 billion years old. So it does change, and it can change. You cannot claim that you know this. Okay, so that's just a side point. Now he goes on to say the Quran says it is he who created the heavens and earth in 6 days and then established himself above the throne. So let's forget about the 6-day fallacy and assume for a moment that Allah's day is as long as some Muslims now claim. Okay, first of all, the word in this verse is used is ayam, which can mean days if you translate days, but it can also mean periods or cycles. It doesn't have to be 24-hour days. And the different hadith tradition and different scholars have written about this, and they said that this 24 hours, this word day or ayam, or days or ayam, means 1,000 years, 50,000 years. It can mean anything. It can mean any period of time. Okay. So yes, moving on. I wonder what Allah was doing in those 9 billion years. He must be terribly bored watching stars born and die, planets colliding with one another, black holes swallowing others, and galaxies colliding. He had plenty of time to see all that happened. You need to understand, God is not dependent on time. And we have clear hadiths for that, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that I am time. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala calls himself Dar. Okay, so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not saying that he literally embodies time. Scholars have explained this hadith and said that God is the creator of time. Okay, so we know that God is the creator of time, meaning God is not time or not inside time. time is a creation of God. God is not inside time. So how we experience time, like time passes, like years pass. So Haris Sultan is assuming God experiences time the same way as us, and he would get bored. Okay, so it's absurd for Haris Sultan to think like that. When the Quran clearly says that لَيْسَ كَمِثْلِهِ شَيْءٍ وَهُوَ السَّمِيعُ الْبَصِيرُ. There is nothing like unto Allah. Okay, the Quran clearly says that. Then we go on. So he's making a horrendous argument that actually has no real bearing in the Quran and the authentic sources of Islam. Rather, they contradict. So it shows that Haris doesn't really have that backing, the knowledge backing that he might think he does. First simple microbial life takes another 800 million years to appear. This microbial life doesn't change month for the another 1.8 billion years when the first molecular, so now so on so on. So he just goes on to say that God must have been bored. And then the spice thing of created human beings. Now this is absurd. This just shows that for God, creating something in 1.8 billion years is the same as creating something as 1 billion years or even 1 second. Because for God, time doesn't really affect his experience. God is not inside time. Haris doesn't clearly seem to understand this. Next slide. If any individual uses attitude towards their enemy, okay, so let me just explain what the Haris Sultan here is talking about a bit further in the chapter. So he's talking about how God talks about his enemies or the people, okay, or the kuffar as bad people. So, okay, and he says that you would call them anything other than good. Okay, if any individual use this attitude towards their enemy, ex-partner, as best friend, or any other person they hate, you would call them anything other than good. In our previous lecture, we discussed how Haris Sultan has no real foundation of morality. Haris Sultan cannot claim what is good or what is bad. And we've showed that by a philosopher. I even discussed philosophers in the previous video. So Haris Sultan doesn't really have a base to say something is truly good or bad. It's just his opinion. Okay? It is just literally his opinion. So now if that is his opinion, it doesn't really matter. Some other guy would say that it is good. How are you going to decide in this subjective moral framework of Haris Sultan? You can't. If you guys do not understand this, you can go to my previous video about Haris Sultan and his book. Inshallah, you will get a more clear understanding, inshallah. Now, anger. Now, to get angry with a tiny individual, now what I want to focus on is here. He's saying that God gets angry on his slaves and his servants and he gets mad. Okay? Now, to get angry with a tiny individual for having sex outside marriage, a God who gets angry so much that he chooses stoning, one of the most barbaric and violent punishments. Now, what I would like to point out here, which completely refutes what Haris Sultan is trying to say, is size does not necessitate value. Just because human beings, compared to the universe or galaxies, okay, is tiny, it doesn't mean a human has less value. How is Haris Sultan deriving just because the size or the matter or the mass of the billions of galaxies is more and the single individual is tiny? Why does it mean that it has less value? What is Haris Sultan really trying to say here? Okay. Now, once again, if I were to decide a punishment that was barbaric and gruesome, how are you going to say it is barbaric? On what basis? 1,000 years ago, it was not barbaric. Today, it for the modern, secular, liberal people, it is barbaric. Maybe in 1,000 years in the future, it might not be barbaric again. And this is what Haris Sultan, in his view of morality, says, that moral paradigms change throughout generation and they evolve. There is no way for Haris Sultan to claim that this view of barbarism won't change in the future. Okay? So it's an absurd argument that he's trying to make. He cannot base it on anything. Let's move on. Hatred for women. I'm gonna keep this short, okay? Because in the next chapter, in the next video, all Harith Sultan does is talk about the hatred of women, the rights of women. He's basically simping in his next chapter, which will be the fifth chapter. In his fifth chapter, he's basically simping at that point. Okay? Beta male. In Islamic tradition, the most famous rhetoric you get is that Islam is the only religion that gives women equality. Muslims believe that when a good pious man dies, he goes to heaven and gets 72 virgins. But when a good pious woman dies, she goes to heaven and gets her own husband. My partner once joked, or at least I hope she joked, that she's glad she's not Muslim because she can stand me in this life, let alone for all eternity. Okay? So, I don't know why he had to talk about his personal life, kind of weird. But let's look what he's trying to say here. He's saying that Islam doesn't give rights. Now you need to understand, what does equality mean between a man and a woman? Islam does not give equality in the sense that opportunities. Islam does not give equality in the sense as responsibilities. And that is obviously, we can reason why. Because they have different roles in societies. There are different things that men and women are better at. Okay? And then you also need to understand that when we say Islam gives equality, we mean objectively. Because the only thing that can objectively determine what is equal is God. And Quran is very clear about that. In the sight of God, no man is better than a woman, and no woman is better than a man. The only thing that determines their value, who is better, who is worse, okay, who is not equal, is their taqwa, their God consciousness. Okay? So yeah. So he's strawmanning the Islamic position at this point. Then he talks about vengeful and genocidal. Once again, Haris, if you're not able to prove your morality and give a good basis for your morality, you cannot make a moral argument. Harith Sultan cannot make a moral argument. Harith Sultan is a subjectivist, consequentialist, utilitarian. Okay? In his view, consensual, protective, incest is completely fine. I don't think a guy like that can give us any, he cannot act that he has a moral high ground and then write a book. He just can't. I'm sorry. Now let's go and see what he says. Vengeful. This God is so obsessed with flattery that anyone who doesn't acknowledge him in the world, he threatens to burn in hell for eternity. Now this is a fallacy. This is a non sequitur. Just because God says that whoever does not acknowledge him, he will burn him in hell, means that he is obsessed with flattery. How is Harith Sultan going from, if someone doesn't believe in God, he'll burn in hell, to God being obsessed with flattery? It doesn't follow. There can and there are different reasons. Okay, by flattery. Okay, by the way, in Islamic view, we do believe that God is the only one who has a right to have pride. Okay, actual kibble. But it doesn't mean that he gets jealous when you ascribe partners to him. Okay, or he's obsessed with flattery that if you don't worship him, you'll go to hell. No, you need to understand that the reason, and this is a philosophical argument, the reason that you go to hell if you don't worship God, the reason that you go to hell if you don't worship God is because the reason of your existence is to worship him. The very core of your being, you're going completely to the opposite of it. The very core of your essence, your zat. Okay? And also, you need to understand the punishment of something that you're doing against something that is eternal or infinite should also be infinite. Let me explain. You take a dollar from a billionaire, you steal it, you steal a dollar from a billionaire. How much should your punishment be? Not that much, because he's a billionaire. A dollar isn't anything for him. Now let's say you go to Pakistan or Yemen, your kids are starving. Okay, a dollar means that they can survive for days, and then you take a dollar from them. Should your punishment be more or less? Now you say that your punishment should be a lot, even though the dollar, the act is the same. You look at who you're doing the sin or the who you're doing the act towards. That decides your punishment. Now let's say someone was infinitely poor, unimaginably poor. Your punishment would be relative to that. Doesn't matter how small amount of how small amount you stole from that person. Okay, so similarly, when you sin against God, who is an eternal, infinite being, your punishment is relative to that. Okay, I hope that is clear. Inshallah. Let's move on to the genocidal part. Not only does this God threaten to torture people in hellfire, but also he isn't shy about destroying civilization on earth over disagreements. Then he talks about Lut alayhi salam and so on and so forth. Okay, so yes, Islam does. Why is it wrong? Why is it wrong for God to give you something and then take it away? God gave you life. Why is it wrong for you to take? Why is it wrong for him to take it? Why is it morally wrong for him to take what he has given you without you even doing something to get it? Because obviously before you were alive, you didn't do anything to get that life. So why is God responsible for not taking it? Why should God be held responsible for taking it away whenever he likes? It is his property. Okay, so there is nothing immoral. Okay, God cannot be immoral. God is the creator of morality. You need to understand that, Harris. For example, God creates the color red. God creates the color yellow. God created the color blue on my cap. Does that mean God is the color blue? Does that mean God is the color red? No. Similarly, God creates morality. The immoral acts that people do, God is the creator of that. But that doesn't mean that God is immoral. God cannot be attributed with immorality. I hope that is clear, inshallah. Next slide. Simply evil. Once again, Harris. I just refuted that in the previous slide. I'll do that again. So he talks about we blame only the government for corruption, but at least it didn't know that crime was being committed. The omnipotent God was sitting on his throne in the skies, watching the whole ordeal, and did absolutely nothing. Once again, is God obliged to do something? Okay, or could there be a reason from his wisdom that he doesn't intervene? Could there be a hikmah, a wisdom behind it? Yes, obviously. Okay, because there is a hadith, okay, where the one, I'm paraphrasing the narration, the one who got the worst suffering on earth, okay, and there would be another person who got the most blessings, the best life on earth. So one person will have the worst life, one person will have the best life on earth, and Allah will take them near heaven. So who had the best life, he will go near heaven and he'll just get a glance of heaven, and he will say, oh, my life was miserable, I did not have anything. The one who had the best life on earth, when he'll get a glance of heaven, he'll say, my life wasn't anything. And when the guy who had the worst life, so the individual who had the worst life, he'll be shown hell, he'll say, oh, my life was so good. This shows that even if someone has a horrible death or a life, it doesn't necessitate that God should intervene. Maybe God has something better for him or her in the hereafter. It is not a logical impossibility. It is a logical possibility. So if I show one logical possibility, a counter argument is refuted. This is just known as, if anyone has studied logic, you'll realize that if someone makes a universal claim, for example, something is impossible. Okay, for example, he says for Chinese people to exist, for China doesn't exist. Someone makes this claim, China doesn't exist. All I need to do is show one Chinese person who that the one who made that claim. So let's say Harris said China doesn't exist. All I need to do is show one Chinese. Okay, that'll refute him. I don't need to show him all Chinese. All I need to do is show him one Chinese to refute his claim. Similarly, when Harris Sultan says that God should have done something to stop the evil, all I need to show him is one reason why God could have not wouldn't have intervened. Meaning, I can show the possibility of his wisdom that refutes Harris Sultan's claim. Simple as that. Now let's move on. Now, vague pseudo-philosophical statement is God has given us free will. See, I didn't even use the free will argument because why? Well, first of all, I'm actually really good at philosophy. And second of all, even if we do use the free will argument, there are a lot of reasons that this argument can still be made. Now, let's first read it. This free will explanation causes multiple problems. But most Muslims don't bother to question it. Why would this omnipotent and merciful God protect the free will of pedophilic, rapist, and murderer over an innocent 7-year-old girl? Free will to survive? Once again, there can be a wisdom. The wisdom to test the individual. Okay? So, one of the reasons that God has given us free will is to establish a proof against us, a hujjah against us, basically, we would say it in Arabic or Urdu, which means a proof against us. So on the day of judgment, we humans cannot say, "Oh Allah, I never did that crime. Why are you punishing me?" Allah will be able to show that you did that crime of your free will. So the free will argument can definitely be made. Harris Sultan just doesn't know the intricacies of the free will argument. It's just simple as that. Some other problem with God. Okay, and I believe this is the last slide. The whole notion of this omnipotent God creates a lot of problems. Let's see the problem, shall we? God has created a sick, fallible, and immoral. God created a sick, okay, sure. Yet he wants us to be healthy. Okay, it's like I make someone with one arm and give him the task that only people with 2 arms can do. God has deliberately made humans fallible, but wants us to be infallible. Okay, so first I'll refute the second. Nabi, Prophet Muhammad said, every son of Adam is a sinner, but the best of the sinner is the one who repents. So we know from Islam that every human sins. God doesn't want you to be infallible. God knows you're fallible, but God wants you to return to him. So this is a complete straw man of the Islamic position. Complete straw man. He is not refuting Islam at this point. He's refuting some other religion that is not Islam, with the absurd points that he's making. Let's move on to the next point. If God has given you cancer, you should accept it as his will. Why rebel against his wishes and desires? Because we have narrations. God can put you through a test to see how you react. Okay? There's a very good saying from the scholars. How do you know that if you're being put through a test or a punishment? It is how you react to it. If it is a punishment, if it is a punishment from God, then you will move further from God. If it was a test, that even the suffering that you get from God, you'll move towards God. So if you have, for example, you have cancer, and due to cancer, you stop praying. You say, "Oh no, I hate God because he gave me cancer." That was a punishment. But if you say, "I am from the Sabirun, I am from the people who has patience. Okay, and you move closer to God, then it was a test. It doesn't mean you will necessarily be cured. Okay, but you need to understand that just because you die of an illness doesn't mean you'll go to hell. This the life of the test of this life doesn't it doesn't have to do with you dying healthy or you dying rich. It has to do with you dying with taqwa in your heart. Haris, put this in your thick skull. We are not materialists. We are not materialist. This God wants to be worshipped so badly that if we don't suck up to him 24/7, he'll burn and torture us for eternity. Now look at what he's basically saying the same thing. He wants you to worship him. Like he has some desire for you to worship him. Okay? Or he won't survive if you don't worship him. Okay? Okay, like how Harris seeks attention, okay, from Richard Dawkins. This is the type of view that he has of God. No, Harris. Okay, fine. Maybe my creator is an egomaniacal creature, but he doesn't even want to show any evidence for his existence. This is an absurd claim. Evidence for God has been given for thousands of years. Okay, the contingency argument for God, the moral argument for God, the kalam cosmological argument for God. Okay, and even the presuppositionalist position and their argument for God. There are many arguments for God. And then we have Ijad al-Quran, the argument for from prophecies. Ibn Ghazali rahimullah, in his book, he said that it is necessary for a rational person to know and be able to demonstrate the existence of God. And I showed that in our previous lecture. Okay, moving on. The best way to tell us about his existence was revelations to men who owned slaves and sex slaves and had child brides. Find he couldn't find better ways, but why stop 1400 years ago? Okay, now once again, Horace, you need to understand morality comes from God. Morality comes from God. You cannot say something that God sent you is immoral, and then based on you saying that, you say that God doesn't exist. You're going the opposite way. You're going in an illogical way. Okay? If God is all knowing, all wise, and all just, whatever he says necessarily has to be correct, because he's all wise, all just, and all knowing and truthful. So he will say what is right. If he says something is moral, then it is truly moral. Okay? Even if it has to do with sex slaves or anything. Regarding child brides, Islam doesn't say child bride. Anyone who is not mature enough to be married, Islam is completely against that. Okay? Okay. So yeah, very easy refutation of this chapter. How Sultan is making fallacious argument left and right. Okay, so with that, let's end today's podcast broadcast. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.